Welcome, my friends. In the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft, we learn the terrible story of Wilbur Whatley, the son of Lavinia Whatley, and the horror that made Dunwich a place better not visited, and at most, driven through rapidly. In Part 6, Dr. Armitage and his friends headed to Dunwich to confront the horror, finding devastation and loss. In Part 7, Dr. Armitage and his colleagues have found the monster's location, leaving the people of Arkham to head into the hills to fight it on Sentinel Hill. Witness the epic final battle between the monster and the men from Arkham as the fate of mankind is decided. Be cautious as you watch, as even viewing from afar can have dire effects when observing elder things. Now, come and sit, as it is time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. In the end, the three men from Arkham, old, white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-grey Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding the focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group that remained in the road. And as they climbed, they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swathe trembled, and its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whatley, of the Undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swathe. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak which overlooked the swathe at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party was seen to gain the minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. Then Weasley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that this sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whatley snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage above and behind the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with marvellous effect. Those without telescopes only saw an instant's flash of grey cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain. Curtis, who had held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground had not 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan, half inaudibly. "Oh, great God! That... There was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him. "We got in a barn, an old maid was squirming ropes. Whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything, with dozens of legs like hogsheads that have shut up when they step. Nothing solid about it, all like jelly, and all made of separate wriggling ropes they're pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it. 10 or 20 mouths or trunks are sticking out all along the sides, as big as stovepipes, and all are tossing and opening and shutting, all grey with kind of blue or purple rings. And God in heaven, that half-face on top. This was his final memory. Whatever it was proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned the rescue telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Through the lenses were discernible 3 tiny figures, apparently running towards the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strangely unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of Sentinel Hill itself. It was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising his hands above his head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstances, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a low chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette on that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in the mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess it's saying the spell," whispered Wheeler as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly and in a singularly curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly, the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon, and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with a concordant rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for portents of storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass that they were all raising their arms in the rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed upon the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills. Then lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone on the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope in that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace with which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat were they born, for the organs of man can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather, one would have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone on the peak. It is almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of their ghastly infra-bass timbre spoke to dim seats of consciousness and terror far subtler than the ear. Yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably, though vaguely, that of half-articulate words. They were loud, loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, and yet they came from no visible being. And because imagination might suggest a conjectural source in the world of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain base huddled still closer and winced as if in expectation of a blow. Rang the hideous croaking out of space. The speaking seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but saw only the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation grew near its culmination. From what black wells of archonautic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness, or obscure, long-latent hereditary, were those half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn. Presently, they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy. But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetor that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance. Green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow-grey, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day, there is something queer and unholy about the growths around that fearsome hill. Curtis Whatley was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain in the beams of a sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those that had reduced the group of natives to a state of cowed quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. "The thing has gone forever," Armitage said. "It has been split up into what it was originally made of, and can never exist again. It was an impossibility in the normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any real sense we know. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe. some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could have ever called him for a moment on the hills. There was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Whatley began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so that he put his hand to his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it had left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon him again. Oh my God, that half face on top of it, that face with the reddish eyes and crinkly albino hair and no chin like the Whatleys. It was an octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing, but there was half-shaped man's face on top of it, and it looked like Wizard Whately's, only it was yards and yards across. He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in a bewilderment not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whatley, who wonderingly remembered ancient things, but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud. 15 year gone? He rambled. I heard old Whatley say as how someday we'd hear a child of Lavini's a-calling his father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill. But Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham man anew. What was it, anyhow? And however did young Wizard Whatley call it out of the air it come from? Armitage chose his words carefully. It was, well, mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whatley himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm gonna burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whatleys were so fond of. The beings they were gonna let intangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whatleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did. So concludes the Dunwich Horror. The world is safe for now, but at what cost for the defenders of our existence? Our next story continues the work of Lovecraft with the classic Call of Cthulhu. I also have 1-minute stories that blend together to form a longer original story, currently based in the world of the Cthulhu mythos. If you enjoyed the tale, click like to let others know. Subscribing will let you travel with us on future adventures, and the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our band of intrepid explorers of the unknown, come visit us on Patreon, where we have a Discord server where you can share in the discussion about the stories told with both myself and the other members. There will also be behind the scenes content and options to guide which stories are chosen. Let me know in the comments if you would like to experience more Lovecraft in later episodes, and if there are any specific stories you would like to see portrayed in this format. See the description for details of the Patreon, our other social media pages, and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about Arkham Horror board games. Until next time, farewell, but be aware, today's battle was only won in a never-ending fight against the forces of dark.